This is the CFF site's preseason preview series, wide receivers and tight ends. And Mike, as we start this show, let me just throw out a couple of things real quick that's new. First of all, my background. I don't have the virtual background. I got a little jealous of you having a new background this year. So what I thought is I would dust off the shelves. I have them looking nice and clean and bare. So you know what I was thinking? Maybe I throw this over to the listeners and say, who wants to have their teams up on the shelf behind me, right? Who wants to go ahead and start sending some of their mini helmets in from their teams representing? Send them over to me at the CFF site. I'll give you a shout out, but let's start representing. I've cleared the shelves, Mike. We're starting from scratch, man. So we're gonna up our game up. We're gonna up our game a little bit this moving forward this year, and then also, man, we just uploaded onto the site the CSV for the underdog contest that now all of anyone that comes in and gets a membership can now take our top 300 rankings at the positions, upload them into underdog, do those best ball contests as well. You've already gotten started on those. Real quick before we get into wide receivers, how's that going, man? I think they launched it, just 3 days ago?
Yeah, and there was an incredible edge for us CFF types who have been playing best balls, since what, March at this point.
Yeah.
We were a little caught off guard though because we saw last year, and it did work to an extent. Quarterbacks just going hot and heavy, which we're not really used to seeing as a CFF community, just because we're a lot of us are used to kind of punting the position. And we were caught off guard last year. Now we're almost caught off guard this year because we've seen the strategy almost shift. And it's more running back focused at the top this year. So you kind of have to adjust. And it's weird because it feels like every draft that I've been in, and I've been in with 7 or 8 now. Every draft's different. Some are going back to last year where they're like super quarterback heavy at the top, so you have to adjust. Sometimes it's running back heavy at the top, and you got two teams that are just going running backs all through the first 5 rounds in a sense. So you just got to kind of adjust on the fly. But it's been a lot of fun so far.
Good stuff. So we've got that CSV available on the site. You can upload it into Underdog. And again, the greatest thing about our preseason content, Mike, and I think we cannot underscore this enough, is that the preseason fantasy draft guide, the preseason projections, it is not baked in. It's not a one size fits all. We update this thing as news comes in late spring, early summer, midsummer, late summer, preseason camp. It really is organic material that we kind of evolve throughout the seasons leading up to kickoff of week one. So if you're having your draft now, it's set based on the best information that we have at this time. And if you do your drafts a little bit closer to the season, which I'm a huge advocate for, I like doing it 2-3 weeks out because that way you maximize the amount of information you can get for your league. We're going to be updating stuff all the way up until probably the second to last week, that week before week 0 kicks off. So come in, get an All-American Heisman membership, or come in, just get the preseason fantasy draft guide. All the material that you're used to every year is live on the site, Mike. But let's get into, we're going to do receivers and tight ends on this show. Probably dip our toe into the waters on tight ends a little bit, as talking like philosophy. How do we really approach tight end in drafts? We're not going to really go into a lot of the deep names, maybe touch some folks here or there, some real surface level stuff. But let's dive into the receivers. Our receivers seem to be the one position, I think, more than any other throughout the preseason that kind of move around a little bit because there's so many of them, right? You go 1, 2, 3 deep for a lot of teams. But like we've done on previous shows, let's just kind of start somewhere, and that is familiar faces in new places, right? And so we'll start right at the top. We talked about Zach Kittley going over to FAU. We talk about Easton Messer, Caden Veltkamp, both of those guys coming over from Western Kentucky. That's the connection there that's over at FAU. Expecting a big year from Easton Messer, and that's why he's at the top in elite company with the names Jordan Tyson, Jeremiah Smith, up at the top of the list, Ryan Williams. But Easton Messer's name is amongst that group, Mike. There's a lot to like there in that offense with what we think they're going to do this year, right?
Yeah, and we've talked about it ad nauseum here and on other podcasts, right? It's Zach Kittley coming over from Texas Tech and previous to that Western Kentucky, where we had those Bailey Zappi, Jarrett Stearns type seasons where they were far and away the QB one and then the wide receiver one in that season. What was it, 2021 or something like
Yeah.
that? And so. I don't know, just based on the spring reporting, right? That's kind of what we heard is that they are going to be, going back to the roots of official air raid here under Kitley. And so we want that highly coveted slot position. That's going to be Easton Messer. He already has a rapport with quarterback Caden Veldkamp as they both come over from Western Kentucky. And yeah, we saw it immediately, that rapport in the spring game where he had 100 yards and two touchdowns. So, I think people feel more comfortable in the second round for Easton Messer, particularly in a half point PPR setting. But full point, I am more than happy to, smash the draft button in the first round for Easton Messer.
You know what Easton Messer to me feels like, Mike? When we were doing his projections, he's one of those players that like the name doesn't, it's not there, right? It's not the Jeremiah Smith, it's not Ryan Williams. But every time we kind of crunch the numbers looking at the offense in the system, he reminds me a little bit. I go back, I was looking this up while you were talking. 2018 Andy Isabella at UMass. Do you remember that? I remember that year and thinking to myself, I can't put Andy Isabella as my number one wide receiver, but everything that I'm looking at, all the numbers that I'm crunching, kind of makes me think that this guy is going to have a really huge top five year. Andy Isabella caught 102 passes, almost 1,700 yards, 13 touchdowns that year. I'm not saying that's going to be Easton Messer this year, but like when you put him in the pool of Jordan Tyson, Ryan Williams, Jeremiah Smith, Easton Messer's your fourth best option, but he has a chance to really put up some numbers this year.
Yeah, it's the inherent risk that you take with that, right? Like, we've seen Easton Messer play at this point, but he's clearly not at the talent level of a Jeremiah Smith or a Jordan Tyson, right? Who have already proven that they are, bona fide first round, NFL draft pick and first round CFF talent. So there is a bit of risk with Easton Messer, but the upside is tremendous, right? If it's the offense that we believe it's going to be, then he will almost easily surpass the projection that we have for Jordan Tyson and Jeremiah Smith if everything comes to fruition.
Yeah, and look, sometimes when you're drafting players, you're drafting them versus a name that we're familiar with. So let's go to that place next, and let's go over to Missouri, where Kevin Coleman comes in from Mississippi State. He was their best receiver last year, comes over to Missouri. Now we're expecting him to take over that position where Luther Burden has kind of nailed down the last few years over there at Missouri. Can we expect similar numbers from Kevin Coleman? In that spot where Luther Burden was. Again, one thing we get with Kevin Coleman, we do have some proven ability with him. Is he the talent of Luther Burden? That's arguable. That's debatable, right? Maybe not, at least just from a name sense. But there is some potential there in that offense. And so we have Kevin Coleman penciled into that spot where Luther Burden was with Missouri last year. And that's a familiar face in a new place. Anything about Kevin Coleman that maybe I'm missing?
No, I think you hit it on the head in terms of proven, right? Like, we saw him do it at the SEC level last year at Mississippi State. And then obviously the slot position is the, coveted position, if you will, in that Missouri offense. So, I do like him just because we've seen him do it in the SEC where, some guys that are transferring up from G5 to P4, like, we don't have to worry about that with Kevin Coleman. I think the biggest probably question mark with Kevin Coleman is quarterback with Bo Perbula, right? It could be a potential downgrade from even a Brady Cook. So I think that's the biggest hesitation with anything to do with Kevin Coleman.
Yeah. Let's go over to Iowa State, where Iowa State has had to replace Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, right? Two receivers that caught 80 passes last year for the Cyclones. We got Rocco Beck returning at quarterback, so we got some continuity there, but this receiver staff is starting over. They bring in Chase Soule and Xavier Townsend, two transfers. Soul averaged almost 20 yards of reception last year at East Carolina. Right now, projected wide receiver one for us with Iowa State. Better program. Are we expecting the 19 yards per reception that he did at East Carolina? At least I know I'm not. But a wide receiver one there where we have some familiarity with name recognition in an Iowa State offense that should be pretty good. Remember, they played last year for a Big 12 championship. Chase Soul, familiar name, new place. I think he only caught maybe 34 passes at Iowa State last year, somewhere in the 30s, but I know he averaged almost 20 yards of reception. We should see his receptions nearly double this year. If he could go anywhere close to that yards per catch, he's going to be great value this year for fantasy owners. And I believe Soul's a top 25 receiver for us headed into the 2025 season. What am I missing?
Not much. I think what I like about Chase Ol and Xavier Townsend is that they just feel like one for one replacements for Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel. They're not as talented, right? And there's some risk factor in terms of we're getting Chase Ol coming up from the G5 level. Xavier Townsend has some proven track record at the P4 level, but not a ton, right? He's averages like 7 yards per catch. But they're going to fill in those exact same spots, right? Chase Soul being the big bodied guy on the outside, Xavier Townsend kind of the shiftier guy in the slot. So I think what I really like about these two is that outside of maybe the tight ends for Iowa State, the Cyclones don't have any other proven receivers that have done anything to this point, right? You remember, I said this all the time in our DFS write-ups last year. It was Higgins and Noel were accounting for like 60% of the target share. They were literally throwing it to nobody else.
Yeah.
And assuming that happens again this year, I think the tight ends will be a bigger factor for Iowa State. But assuming that kind of happens where just those two guys are getting the targets, I'd expect them to have really solid seasons.
Yep. And two more guys as before we get outside of the top 40. Dazon Stribling comes over from Oklahoma State to Ole Miss. Remember, Trey Harris last year in 8 games caught 60 passes for Ole Miss, averaged 17 yards a reception, topped 1,000 yards. Had he played a healthy full 12 games, he would have been really good, at least from the fantasy standpoint, right? He would have had monster numbers. Can he come in and fill that wide receiver one? We have him projected at wide receiver one. My feeling is we'll see it spread out maybe a little bit more. You've got Caden Lee there. I think we got what is it
Trey
Harrison
Wallace or Harrison
That's
Wallace,
right.
Trey Wallace, whatever. Yeah.
So I'm expecting to see it spread out a little bit more this year, where maybe like Harris was that man. They went to him all the time, but I do think the talent is there for Stribling to possibly be that legit clear wide receiver one in that Ole Miss offense this year. Where do you stand on Ole Miss receivers?
Yeah, I'm with you in terms of I think it's going to be bunched a little bit. They have a lot of options, right?
Yep.
You got Caden Lee, who is a tremendous slot receiver, to go along with Deshaun Stribling. Trey Wallace, the Penn State transfer,
That's
comes
right.
out, transfers over, and he'll start opposite Stribling, I believe. And then just factor in two tight ends in Luke
Daquan.
Haas and Daquan Wright, right? So there's a lot of mouths to feed, and there's probably a couple younger guys that I'm for blanking on right now that probably could be in the mix as well. So yeah, I like Stribling and Caden Lee, and I think they will definitely be 1-2 there. But I'm kind of with you. Targets dispersed a little bit, and it's not set in stone, right? That Stribling is going to be that wide receiver one there.
Yep. And then one more. Dane Key comes over to Nebraska from Kentucky. Big acquisition for the Cornhuskers. Gives Rayola a legitimate wide receiver one option. Dana Holgerson kind of has that, he's been known to really produce some good wide receiver ones in his offense. This is something you and I have talked about as well. The way they used Ja'Cory Barney last year as well. We feel like he's going to be in line to get some more touches. They bring in Hunter, the transfer from Cal. So there's several options there at Nebraska. But right now we've got Dane Key, legitimate number one option. We saw what he did at Kentucky the last couple of years and should slide in very nicely as a good wide receiver one option for Dylan Raiola. I think the main question for me is will there be a lot of separation between that wide receiver one at Nebraska and then wide receiver two and wide receiver three? And my feeling is this year, we may not see the large separation from wide receiver one versus two and three with Raiola at quarterback and maybe some good options to spread the ball around this year. That may be why I don't have Key up super high in my rankings, but I still think he's a good, safe top 30, 35 receiver this year for college fantasy football. How about yourself?
Yeah, I also have Key as wide receiver one there for Nebraska, and I think the difference between him and Barney, I could see a scenario where they both have the same amount of receptions, but Dane Key's going to average like 15 yards per catch, whereas Ja'Cory Barney's probably going to average 10 to
Right.
11 yards per catch, right? And I don't have our projections
Plus,
up.
Barney might get some end around, quick sweeps, stuff like that, get touches on other
Yeah.
areas.
I don't have our projections up this second, but I wouldn't be surprised if we have double the amount of touchdown receptions for Dane Key over Barney as well. So I think both are draftable. Key is going much higher than Barney, but yeah, I think the separation is going to be where you're going to see a lot more downfield passes to Key and some of those, end arounds, within the 10-yard line of scrimmage type dump offs to
Yep.
Ja'Cory Barney.
Now let's go into a few programs that we talk about. These are some programs that you and I have spent a lot of time discussing, and I'm sure you have on some other podcasts. But I like to kind of give people a glimpse behind the curtain of how you and I kind of go back and forth on some of these. And let's just start at Syracuse, right, where Trevor Pena has moved on to Penn State. But you don't have Aronde Gadsden there, that big receiving type tight end this year. So a lot of what we were talking about in the preseason, you've got Darrell Gill Jr. there. They bring in Jonte Cook, who's uber talented, but just can't seem to kind of get roots in the ground anywhere. But everywhere he goes, everybody talks about his talent. And then you've got Justin Ross Simmons right there that's just kind of in the background that's probably going to get some good target. He'll get some good target volume this year. And when we were talking, it was like, hey, does Jonte Cook come in? Does that kind of, what does that do for the wide receiver core? I feel really good that Gill is going to be the top option there. I think Jonte Cook is the wild card, but I still think there's some value there at Justin Ross Simmons. And this was something you and I talked about. And the reason being, quite obvious, they had three receiving options last year. Aronde Gadsden was really a wide receiver option for them. So I think that does open the door for some fantasy value for Justin Ross Simmons too. Kind of aligned with that's kind of where you and I were at when we were kind of doing the projections this year.
Yeah, I think it's a near certain. Well, it's absolutely certain that tight end Dan Villari is not going to get what the volume that Aronde Gadsden got in the past game. Right, that was 108 targets. Dan Villari is not getting that. You look back at this offensive coordinator when he's called plays at the collegiate level, like the tight end one is averaging like 20 targets per season. So that's 80 vacated targets that we need to disperse amongst the wide receivers. And like you just mentioned, we already had two or three wide receivers last year for Syracuse Pop. So now you get to shift 80 more targets over to the wide receiver room. I like to draft all three potentially, not in the same best ball team in these 30 round drafts, but I'll get shares of all three, divvying it out a little bit in some of my drafts. We do feel good about Darrell Gill being the wide receiver one there. Not a sure thing, but that's our projected guy for now. Jonte Cook probably starts in the slot where Trevor Pena played last year, also had 100 plus targets there. And then, yeah, we talked about it. We were kind of thrown in a loop with Justin Ross Simmons, right? We listened to one podcast that said the beat writer projected that Ross Simmons would lead the team in receptions this year. So I'm fine with taking stabs on all three players in various drafts that you do this offseason.
Yeah, let's go to a team where I think we're going to have three legitimate options. And I think this is pretty cemented in. Let's go over to Clemson, right? Where you've got Antonio Williams, TJ Moore, Bryant Westco. The question that you and I were kind of batting back and forth is there much separation between each of these three guys, between wide receiver one, wide receiver two, and wide receiver three? In short, the projections and rankings do reflect that there will be, because one, what Antonio Williams did last year, and he was fairly consistent with what he did. But given the talent level we could make a case that these three guys could be a lot closer than maybe where their projections or where their rankings could be right now when we go to the end of 2025 and we look at that Clemson offense. And remember, we've got Cade Klubnik as one of the top and debatable on being the top fantasy quarterback going into the 2025 season. There, I can make a case where these three guys could be a lot closer together than where we have them ranked, but I feel good with where we have them right now.
Yeah, it's tough with Clemson because on a talent scale, like these guys are all top 20 in the country, right? It's arguably the most talented room in the country as far as wide receivers go, but you gotta it's tough when we were projecting this out because like you when you do their projections, they're not always going to pop the way that you think they would, right? Because it's just there's only so many
Yeah.
targets and receptions to go around, right? So you got to divvy it up somewhere. I think this is kind of similar to Syracuse though, where it could help a Bryant Wesco or a TJ Moore. Clemson doesn't have a Jake Stool this year.
Correct.
And they really don't throw a ton to their running backs either. We'll see if they do throw to Adam Randall being a former wide receiver. But there's going to be targets to be or some of those vacated targets to go to wide receivers now because there's no Jake Stool. So I like drafting each one of these three receivers. I just don't know, say a TJ Moore, for example, probably the most talented guy in that room, but like, is he going to meet his round five, round six draft capital because there's also a Bryant Wesco, because there's also a Antonio Williams there?
Yeah, the room feels like to me we've got really three really solid options. If I were to put stock into one, I'd take Antonio Williams just because of what he was able to do with Klubnik next year. But I do think that every one of these guys has a pretty high floor when you compare other top three receivers, the top three receivers from other teams.
Agreed.
Um, LSU, Mike. LSU, a lot of mouths to feed in that offense. The more I look at LSU, the more I think, man, do I have the wide receivers high enough with Garrett Nussmeier there? You've got Chris Hilton Jr., who really disappointed last year, but from all signs in spring camp, had a really good spring. I think that's good signs for him. Was a real vertical threat at the end of the year. And if he can do that all year, that's going to be tremendous value there from a fantasy standpoint. You got Aaron Anderson, who kind of was fantastic for Nussmeier last year. So it's hard to think he takes a step back from what he did last year. Then they bring in Nick Anderson in from Oklahoma. They bring in Barry and Brown in from Kentucky. And just to kind of give everybody a peek behind the curtain, I think for you and I, most of the conversation was around not necessarily who was wide receiver one and two, but maybe where does Nick Anderson fit in? Where does Barry and Brown fit in? And I think sometimes we were on different sides of the fence. I personally feel I like Barry and Brown. I like Hilton's ability to kind of take the top off the defense. I think Aaron Anderson can move all over the middle of the field. He can work between the numbers. And for me, the reason why I like Barry and Brown over Nick Anderson is I feel like they can move Brown all over the formation. I feel like he can play outside. I feel like he can play inside. I feel like he can be moved all around. He's more versatile option. But I do think all four of these guys are going to be an option. Then you figure in you got Trey'Dez Green, who is the athletic tight end. Trey'Dez Green. You brought in Bauer Sharp from Oklahoma. Mike, a lot of mouths to feed in this LSU offense this year.
Yeah, for those viewers on YouTube, here's a peek behind the scenes of how we did our projections. I'm going to take off my headphones real quick. We took this hat right here, dropped in the names and shake it out and picked one out, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we did with the LSU wide receivers. And I'm embellishing a little bit, right? But um, we settled on Chris Hilton as wide receiver one, and I do feel good about that. I think, we saw it kind of in the last couple games there, especially in the bowl game, how much of a game breaker he can be in this offense. I just think he has a bit more upside to be a difference making fantasy option than Aaron Anderson, who's going to be deployed in the slot, but he's also going to share some time in the slot, in the middle of the field with those tight ends that you mentioned too. And like once you get to the red zone, like
Yep.
where's Nussmeier going to throw the ball to? Is it going to be, Aaron Anderson, or is it going to be the 6'7" Trades Green and the 6'4", 6'5" Bauer Sharp, right? So that's where we kind of lean with Chris Hilton as wide receiver one. I just think a bit more upside with that pick. And Baron Brown, Nick Anderson, we'll see what fall camp transpires. But you can get those guys really late, round 20 and beyond in drafts.
That's the thought of the rankings, right? Like Chris Hilton, it's the upside. It's, he needs 3 catches a game to go for 100 yards and a touchdown. Whereas Aaron Anderson, kind of that safe floor, better option in PPR, probably where you're looking at 5 to 7 receptions, 70 to 80 yards per game, and maybe an occasional tight end. So to your point, that's why Hilton gets the top billing for us in the rankings. Aaron Anderson, more of that kind of safer middle floor when you're looking at wide receiver two. He's probably the best bet. And knowing you still have talented guys like Nick Anderson, Barry Brown, Bauer Sharp, Trades Green, Aaron Anderson just feels like the safest option. And that's why he lands in that second spot for us. But as we transition out of LSU, let's go to another school that kind of, I think it's good to focus on a little bit because Evan Stewart's injury kind of shook things up over at Oregon. And, kind of giving everyone a glimpse into our conversations. There were a lot of hesitations between you and I, even before Evan Stewart's injury, to put him at wide receiver one at Oregon. We were landing in that spot, but I can't say that we felt 100% comfortable. DeCorian Moore comes in. He's got all the fanfare. He's got all the hype. Is he really going to do what Tez Johnson did? Very unlikely, although he does have the talent to do it. And then we were leaning like, Kenyon Sadiq's kind of that freak tight end. You and I were on leaning to we were on the side of the fence that maybe this is their best option this year. Maybe this is going to be their best receiver this year, and this guy is at the tight end position. Now, do I think Sadiq leads the team in receptions this year? Probably not. But there's no doubt when it comes to fantasy potential, even at the tight end spot, when we close shop at the end of the 2025 season, it would not surprise me if Sadiq has the better fantasy numbers of all the receiving options in the Oregon offense. However, right now, early on right now, I'm on DeCorian Moore. We're on DeCorian Moore right now as that top spot. And quite honestly, the reason we're landing there is because we're not sure Oregon has we're not sure of what they have proven talent behind DeCorian Moore anyway right now, right?
Yeah, a lot of question marks. You got the oft injured Gary Bryant Jr. You got Malik Benson, who people were high on at Alabama. He flopped. People were high on him at Florida State. He flopped again. And a couple of younger guys, Kyle Casper, Justice Lowe, who he was solid. Last year when he stepped into the starting lineup. But I don't know how much upside he has there. So, I'm kind of with you. The two targets in the passing game that I'm looking to are either Kenyon Sadiq or DeCorian Moore. This has been a system that, for 4 straight years under Will Stein, dating back to UTSA, has produced the wide receiver one has produced 100 plus targets. So that's obviously a position that we are interested in. I think we differ a little bit with Oregon. I do see a scenario where, you got a kind of a green quarterback in Dante Moore. I can see a scenario where they're going to run the football a little bit more this year than they have in years past. So maybe, DeCorian Moore or whoever ends up at wide receiver one is a little less valuable this year than in years past. But I'm with you. I would bet on the upside right now in DeCorian Moore as probably leading the team in targets and receptions. And, that Evan Stewart injury came, after or late spring camp or after spring camp. So I think fall camp reports will be vital there at Oregon.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of, you may see some movement from us. And I think it's important to say that Justice Lowe, right, is kind of that wide receiver two spot for us right now. Again, is he going to be a game breaker receiver? No, but he was solid when he played last year. And so you start to think a little bit, if you're drafting right now, he might be the third option for you for this reason only. DeCorian Moore has the upside, the talent, the youngster coming in, a little green, not proven, but has the upside when it comes to talent level. Kenyon Sadiq's kind of got the body. He's the freak. We've seen him play. We know that he can produce. Quite honestly, when it comes to another receiver now at Oregon, maybe safe is the option. And maybe that's what they're going to need this year is just a nice, solid, complementary option that's reliable. Right now, Justice Lowe fits that profile, even though, to your point, there's a lot of talent on board. I've never been a Malik Benson fan. I'm not going to put my chips on the table on Malik Benson. I wasn't when he was at Florida State after I saw what he wasn't at Alabama. I just refuse to believe that that guy's going to pan out. Could be wrong. I'm not a Malik Benson fan. So
Yeah,
just
and
wanted
these
to get
guys,
that on there.
they're going the Gary Bryants of the world, Justice Lowe, if you believe in Malik Benson. Those guys are going literally last round, round 29, round 30 of best balls. So you don't have to spend up to get any of those guys. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to take a flyer in some
Well, as
drafts.
they should, and that's why, because you don't know what you get, and you take a chance on risking a roster spot by drafting those guys by having someone that doesn't play at all, right?
Yeah.
So you're
Yep.
getting a freebie, but you're playing the lottery.
Agreed.
Let's go to a couple of other programs I think is really important to touch on, Mike. FAU. We talked about Caden Velkamp. We talked about Easton Messer. If they are going to throw the ball around that much, that makes a guy like J.R. Wilson incredibly valuable in fantasy. Or is he getting overlooked a little bit? Is he a little undervalued right now if we do really think he's lock solid wide receiver two in that Owls offense?
Yes and no. It's he's probably the surest bet right now to be wide receiver two. Um, it's not a given at this point, but he's probably the biggest name on the roster that people are familiar with. I was just kind of looking back, the wide receiver two numbers under Kitley over the years, and there was really only one year that it absolutely popped, which is kind of what we were talking about with
Yeah.
Velkamp and Messer, right?
Yep.
So they had Mitchell Tinsley that year in 2021, where Mitchell Tinsley finished as wide receiver nine in all of college fantasy as the wide receiver two under
On his own
Kitley.
team.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, if you look at the other spots or other wide receiver twos over the years, like it's kind of varied, right? You got a wide receiver 60 in there, which is kind of where Sean Wilson's going at this point. But then you got some wide receiver 212 finish, a wide receiver 162 finish. So I don't know that he's being overlooked or anything like that. He's going right around the 20th round in best balls, and I think that's kind of where he should be going at this point until we get some more fall news, coming up here in the next few
So
weeks.
my philosophy was if I were in best ball, I agree with you. If I was in redraft, I'd be willing to take a shot on him a little early. Because if right now, if we know what we know, if it doesn't pan out, he's gone from your roster after a couple of weeks. But to your point, you could have an upside player right there who could potentially be a top 25 receiver in that offense from what we know today, right?
Yep. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, and so we just talked about Western Kentucky. We'll go over to Western Kentucky because we know that they're going to throw the ball around a little bit more this year. They got Maverick McIver at quarterback, I believe. Didn't they come over from, was it Abilene Christian that they came over from? So the
Yep.
offensive coordinator comes over, McIver follows him over. Similar concept from what we saw with Kitley a few years ago at Western Kentucky that was brought in his own quarterback. We don't think Western Kentucky will throw the ball as much as Kitley will over at FAU, but they should put the ball in the air a lot this year. If the spring game was any indication, KD Hutchinson was held out of that spring game, but we're expecting KD Hutchinson to be a volume target in that offense this year for Maverick McIver, and that all of a sudden you bring in a couple of other options as well, which one player we have ranked pretty high is Matthew Henry as a wide receiver two option in that offense. And a name that I threw out to you in the spring, you're like, okay, press the pause button a little bit. But if they throw the ball around a little bit, maybe Musa Berry is another outside option as well. I do think that there are going to be multiple options in the passing game receivers at Western Kentucky this year. And right now, KD Hutchinson, Matthew Henry seem to be the top two. I feel like Western Kentucky has to get a little bit more attention in fantasy drafts this year compared to last year. What are your thoughts?
No, definitely. And it speaks to the fact that really there has been very limited reporting on Western Kentucky so far this offseason because all those wide receivers, the Katie Hutchinsons, Matthew Henry, even throw Musa Berry in there. Like those guys are barely getting drafted until like after round 20. And that's just odd for a team that we know under this new offensive coordinator, Rick Bowie, who, yeah, you mentioned comes over from Abilene Christian. Last 2 seasons, he's thrown the ball 500 plus times. So that's what we expect them to do this season, barring a major surprise there. So it's just that we don't know for sure not only who's going to be the wide receiver one, but we're somewhat unsure of who's going to comprise that starting lineup there with wide receiver two and three there as well. So I just say take shots, spray your bullets around, and get some Katie Hutchinson shares, some Matthew Henry shares, and see what happens.
Yeah. Look, let's go over to GJ Kinney's offense over at Texas State, right? So you've got your receivers like Bo Sparks and Walter Don that come back. And if I'm going to give everybody kind of the peek behind the curtain of the conversations we have in the spring, it's just like the thing that really factors in a lot into our rankings of these receivers, Mike, is where do we land at quarterback on Texas State, right? And so you're hearing reports out of the spring that Brad Jackson looks to be in command of the offense. If Brad Jackson ends up under center for Texas State, you're looking at a more mobile, run friendly quarterback slash system slash offense, which then limits the number of passes that go in the air that might come to Sparks or Don. But then Texas State brings in a lot of options in the transfer portal at quarterback as well. And you're like, okay, is it going to be Jackson in the end? Or will Jackson carve out a niche in this offense where maybe he gets in there similar to where he did in a few instances last year, and we see a more pass friendly quarterback? And as of right now, we have to go with the information that we're presented with, and that is all signs, the tea leaves are pointing to Brad Jackson right now. So we do temper fantasy expectations and projections for guys like Bo Sparks and Chris Don. But I have to tell you, we were reading earlier in the spring, and I was reading that Kinney was basically made a comment. He was quoted as saying that Sparks and Don should be 1,000-yard receivers this year. Now, is it coach speak? Is it tipping his hand to what he's going to do? I don't know. We're kind of lenient on going that far, but the potential is there in the offense, depending who the quarterback is. But I do like Bo Sparks this year. I do want to. I don't care who quarterbacks Texas State. I do like Bo Sparks, but that's kind of where we were at. I think I kind of summarized that up pretty good. What am I missing from Texas State that maybe we discussed that I haven't touched on?
Yeah, I was looking back, and the last time that Kinney had a run first or a run heavy type quarterback was Siobhan Cordero with Hawaii back in 2019. And they actually averaged more passing attempts per game than Texas State did the last 2 years, which I don't know, kind of surprises me a bit because we had obviously clear pass first quarterbacks
Yeah.
these last 2 years with TJ Finley and Jordan McLeod. So maybe that Brad Jackson, if he does win the job, maybe it doesn't have as big of a it's not as big of a factor to some of these Texas State receivers than we initially thought. So, to me, you mentioned the comment from GJ Kinney about potential 1,000-yard receivers for both Chris Dawn and for Bo Sparks.
Right.
Maybe the quarterback doesn't even matter. Maybe it's the fact that Texas State doesn't have a wide receiver three right now or a legitimate wide receiver four in that offense. We know they're not going to throw to the tight ends at all, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it could speak to the fact that it doesn't matter who the quarterback is, and Chris Dawn and Bo Sparks will have value regardless.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the other thing that we talked about too is there seemed to be a tendency where maybe, because I know I was on Lincoln Pear in the spring as well. I kind of cooled off on him a little bit just because I think Burgess returns and didn't they bring in Greg Burrell, I believe, from
Yeah,
UNLV?
he came in,
Left
went
and came
back
back.
into the portal, and then he came back. Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, okay, now they've got 3 miles, decent miles to feed in the backfield. But Lincoln Pear, I feel, has potential to be really good value. But with that going on, I just wonder like if they just kind of share the wealth in the backfield a little bit. But to that point, maybe Texas State runs the ball a little bit more this year. They do have depth in the backfield. Marty did move on to Arizona, but they have three guys that I guess that they feel that they can give the ball to this year too.
And maybe a fourth with Brad Jackson.
Maybe, right, exactly. All right. I had to get to San Jose State eventually. This was this. I don't know if you and I have spoken about a wide receiver core more in the time since we launched, since before we launched the guy when we were doing projections to today. San Jose State, where we're landed on Matthew Coleman at wide receiver one. They bring in the Purdue transfer Leland Smith, who was all the rage in the spring game and seems to be getting all the love at that outside receiver position because the other name that we hear too is Danny Scudero, who's the FCS transfer from Sacramento State, which and we'll talk about where we're going with that. But Coleman and Scudero are kind of both candidates for that inside slot position, and so that's the position that Nick Nash played last year. That's where a ton of the fantasy value lies. But as we gather more information and as we start analyzing who the wide receiver one and wide receiver twos are, the thing that seems apparently obvious is that Leland Smith is going to nail down that outside receiver spot. That may not be as, you know,
Productive. Yeah.
as productive as that slot receiver, but I think there's enough production in that receiver that he's going to be on every fantasy roster. And right now, Mike seems to be the value pick because he seems to be the safest player to be penciled in as a starter right now of those three. Now, I happen to think, and here's my opinion, and we'll give you yours as well. I happen to think that Matthew Coleman has the inside track to get the inside receiver position. There's a lot of love for Danny Scudero. He's not that big. I think he's like a 5'8" receiver, but it doesn't matter. He plays the slot. But remember, Nick Nash was a 6'1" receiver last year. So I do think there will be limitations in the red zone if Scudero gets that chance in the slot. But I just look at Scudero. He came over from Sacramento State. There was nothing that he did that really, really popped off the page to me from a number standpoint and from the highlights I saw. I know he's getting a lot of talk. I don't know if it's the Cam Scatterbo effect. Right now, I'm with Matthew Coleman one, Leland Smith two. I think Danny Scudero's wide receiver three, but Danny Scudero can go from wide receiver three to wide receiver one if he lands that inside position. But right now, I'm sticking with Coleman and Leland Smith right now. Where do you stand as of today? And it could have changed as of when we talked last week.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm sticking with Coleman for now, but I don't think he's as good of a value as Leland Smith for sure, or Danny Scudero, who's, going round 15 and beyond.
He won't
That
now,
might
Mike,
He
because we're
won't
talking
now.
about him.
Well, yeah, and there's other people are talking about him too,
Sure.
and San Jose Summer School just came out too, so we referenced that and we had a conversation about that where the beat writer just was he didn't even mention Matthew Coleman. It was all about Scudero and Leland Smith. So I don't know. I don't think Matthew Coleman's a great value right now, even though I do have him as the projected wide receiver one. Here's what I'm kind of just gleaning from listening to podcasts and such. It doesn't sound like Coleman or Scudero, will move outside potentially. Like I don't it doesn't sound like the starting three is going to be those guys, right? There's
Yep.
going to be somebody else outside to start, maybe a Malachi Riley or whomever. So, how I'm kind of attacking this now is maybe, those 181 targets that Nick Nash got last year, maybe they're split 50-50, 55-45 split between Coleman and Scudero at this point because they're both essentially going to play and probably play extensively in the slot this year, just kind of listening to how much both our players are hyped up. So, I don't love the value of a Coleman right now, going in round 5 or 6. I'd probably take the chance on Scudero if you can get him in round 15. And Leland Smith, as you said, he is the best value of the two or of the three, sorry, because he's going beyond round 20 at this point. I think that's going to last. I think he'll start to creep up as the offseason goes along.
Yeah,
Because if
I
he's
agree.
yeah,
I already moved him up in my rankings just from some of the conversations and things that we uncovered in the last week. We knew we were going to do this show. This was the one receiver set that I just was like, we listened to everything, and here's in a nutshell what we found. All the attention's given to the transfers coming in To Mike's point, there wasn't a lot of talk about Matthew Coleman, but again, you don't really have any returning starters coming back here. Coleman had that good game at the end of the year last year. The one reference to Matthew Coleman, though, was that Scudero barely played in the spring game, and Matthew Coleman had the most targets and most catches in that spring game. You kind of have to take the information for what it's worth. You're only as good as your last game, is what they say. And right now, Coleman and Smith were the two guys that really stood out at receiver in the spring game. We're rolling with them. But to Mike's point, Scudero could come in and totally flip that inside slot position to himself. And right now, Leland Smith seems to be the safest option at that receiver. Completely agree. I think that's where the value's at. Don't be afraid to go up and get him now. I moved him up into, I think, my top 40 rankings as well. And don't forget, you still have Jackson Kane in there as well at tight end as well. He's going to be an option in the red zone as well, particularly if Scudero, like a guy like Scudero, gets that slot position. Are you going to, and this was the point you brought up for LSU, you've got now this big body tight end versus Scudero, who's that like 5'7", 5'8" slot receiver, right?
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I think we would both agree that I mean, we're not going to see a Nick Nash this year, correct?
Right. I would agree with
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I'm on board. Right now, if you want a San Jose State receiver and you want security because you're in a best ball format, I think Leland Smith is your best value right now. If you're in a redraft league, then you kind of have a little bit more flexibility. That's what
Yeah.
I would say.
And don't you can draft two of these guys. I'm not even opposed to drafting three of them in a 30 round, an extended
Right.
draft like that, right? Because they chucked it 552 times last year. So
Exactly. Before we move on to tight ends, Mike, let's just kind of look, as you look at the list of receivers, a couple of names that I just want to bring out for me. We could talk about sleepers. We could talk about players that we want to maybe shy away from a little bit. I look at a team like Miami a little bit where there's not a lot proven coming back. They bring in CJ Daniels, who didn't, look, let's face it, he was great, but he was great at Liberty. He came into LSU last year. He was, third best option at
he was
LSU. It's
fine.
hard for
He
me.
was
Yeah, it's
fine.
hard for
Yeah.
me to see him coming in being the top receiver at Miami. I'm big on Trader this year. Could be a very similar situation like Decoria Moore. Just never saw a lot of him, and then he just kind of burst on the scene. Are there any other players like that for you this year, where very limited exposure or no exposure whatsoever last year, but have a feeling they're going to be a fantasy factor for us this year?
Yeah. Quasi Gilmer at UCLA. I've talked about him a bunch. Just it's sounding like it's going to be the Kurt Ignites system, right? That we saw at Indiana last year, that we saw at James Madison a couple years prior. Wide receiver one, typically on the outside where Gilmer's going to play. That's been multiple 1,000-yard receivers. He's getting drafted in very late in drafts, so I would take a stab there. As a guy we saw glimpses last year as a freshman, but he's kind of new to the scene this year, so maybe not a guy that you're familiar with that you definitely, in my opinion, should get familiar with. Keyshawn Singleton at South Florida. I know we had a conversation about the South Florida receivers recently. Typically, yes, it has been the slot guy in that system that has popped, and that should be Chaz Nimrod, the Tennessee transfer this year. Who I'm not opposed to taking stabs on late there, but Keyshawn Singleton popped in the last month of the season last year for South Florida. So he could be a 1,000-yard receiver there for the Bulls. And then, we just kind of talked about it, like the Western Kentucky, the San Jose States, these teams that are going to be high volume passing offenses where the depth charts are unsettled. Go ahead and take stabs on those players in your drafts.
Yeah, and I think you have to include, one team I'll throw on the radar too is North Texas, right? Like, you would think for as much as North Texas is probably going to throw the ball around, man, we'd love to say, hey, man, we have a top 10, we have a top 20 guy there cemented, but we just don't, right? We got Miles Coleman as the wide receiver one there in that offense. That could change at any point. North Texas is a team, and this is why I would tell you guys that are drafted, not necessarily would you want to invest a lot in North Texas receivers, but that's a team you're going to want to put on your watch list that, maybe 1 or 2 weeks into the season, you're going to see some players emerge right now. Coleman is our safest bet, but that's one of those offenses that you're likely going to have one or two receiving options. But right now, we don't even have a top 30 receiver maybe from that offense right now, right?
Yeah, it's well, Miles Coleman is in that kind of fringe range
Yeah,
there.
fringe. Yeah.
We saw a little bit at the end of last year, but that depth chart's a little fluid at this point. People have been jumping on Landon Sides as the potential wide receiver too. I would caution against that just because again, that depth chart's fluid at this point. Could be Simeon Evans, could be Dalton Carnes, the Houston transfer there. And you look back, the wide receiver two for North Texas, even though how often they throw the football, they tend to spread it out amongst 4 and 5 receivers. Their wide receiver two hasn't finished in the top 100 in any of the last 3 seasons. So I would, Coleman's probably the safest bet there, and we'll see whoever pops maybe on the waiver wire.
Yeah, I mean, and throw out a few more too that I think about. I love the chemistry that it looked like Jacoby Lane last year had with Mayavi at USC last year. Um, Maya Ava. And I'm on the fence that I like Jacoby Lane over Makai Lemon. I think that maybe could be a difference of opinion and could be dependent on whether or not you're in a PPR league or not. I actually think a player like Jordan Napier in that Sean Lewis system at San Diego State, I feel like he's the rock solid wide receiver one in that offense. And the wide receiver one on Sean Lewis is traditionally really good fantasy value. I think he could have a really good year this year as well. And when I look at one more, Mike, I think a guy that's a little, I wouldn't say he's under the radar, but when you look back at his target share last year, and I think he only had one touchdown, a guy like Trent Walker at Oregon State, who I believe caught 80 something passes last year. Had he found the end zone 6 or 7 times last year, there's a chance we're talking about him being possibly a top 20, 25 receiver this year. And sometimes my belief is those law of averages actually catch up. If he catches another 80 passes this year, and remember, Oregon State brought in Malik Murphy from Duke after Duke went out and got Darian Menser from Tulane. If he catches another 80 passes this year, I feel like the law of averages catches up and he catches 6 to 8 touchdowns this year. And I think that's good value for Trent Walker, maybe with where he's getting drafted.
Yeah, I'm that's not a guy that I personally have been drafting. More so because I think the Oregon State wide receiver room is a bit underrated, and we don't have to get in depth with this, but I do like Taz Reddick's there, who potentially starting the slot, and then Darius Clemens, the Michigan transfer. So yeah, Trent Walker is a guy who I think will be a solid producer for you, but yeah, it's just not a high upside guy in my
No,
opinion.
no, but not at all. But
Yeah.
where he's being ranked right now, coming in at wide receiver three, wide receiver four in most rosters, and I think that's a
Yep.
great value for wide receiver three or four. Potential 80 catches, maybe 70 plus, but instead of 2 touchdowns, he's
Maybe
800 yards and
five.
six or
Yeah.
seven touchdowns this
Yeah.
year, right?
PPR, full point PPR definitely gets prioritized.
For sure, for sure. So let's go to tight ends. We spent a lot of time on receivers, and let's be honest, we could probably spend 2 hours just on receivers alone. It's the one position where, like, when you and I go into drafting every year, whether it's best ball format or whether we're redraft, when we shut down the draft, it doesn't matter if we draft 20 rounds, 30 rounds, or 40 rounds. We always feel we've got good options still on the board at receiver, right? Am I like it's just kind of like the way that drafting goes. I feel like if you can punt late on a position after the guys come off the board early, the value guys that you and I talked about, it's wide receiver, right? Doesn't it seem like every draft ends, you still got 5 or 6 quality guys that you really like in your queue?
Yeah, I think one is because wide receiver depth charts aren't settled at this point, right? So a lot of drafters have varying opinions on how those go. So, you differ from other people. So your guys might fall a little bit, right? And then I think, and we've spoken about this on this podcast, right? People are letting those San Jose State, Western Kentucky type guys fall a little bit, who these are going to be high volume passing offenses. So you have a lot of options on the back end of your drafts at receiver.
So as we talk about philosophy with receiver, let's transition over to tight end. And I think that's the one thing before we really just go in depth into who are the names that we like and why or why not. Just philosophy on draft and tight end. And I'll say this: I'm not a big tight end college fantasy football guy. I'm a big fan and proponent. And you and I are different in this. I like rolling in the tight ends into receiver. I don't like playing with tight ends. I just want to open it up. I want all offense. I want quarterback, running back, receivers, roll them into receivers, right? If you have to go to tight end, then there's also a difference of opinion too in where do you go get the first tight end. Are you going to go for a guy like Kenyon Sadiq if you feel like he could be Oregon's best receiving option this year? Do you go as high to get him in round 4 or 5? Traditionally, when there's not a standout tight end, most of the time those tight end 1, tight end 2, you can almost wait to round 6, 7, 8 before you even draft the first tight end. But here's the thing: if I can't get a guy like Kenyon Sadiq and maybe a couple of rounds later get an Eli Stowers, I'm probably punting on tight end maybe until after 10, 12 rounds. Because once when you get past the first 6, 7, 8 tight ends, if you're not drafting on upside, the difference between tight end 12 and tight end 36, Mike, there's just not enough difference for me to go up and draft a tight end in a 25 round draft in the first 13, 14 rounds when there's quality on the board at quarterback, running back, and receiver. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me personally, and I know people disagree with this. For me personally, Kenyon Sadiq is in a bucket of its own,
Mm-hmm.
just from a talent perspective. And then, like, I think he is the closest comparison to Tyler Warren last year in terms of we have a team that we know is going to throw the football a little bit in Oregon and does not have any proven wide receivers, right? Dak Moore's talented, but it's not proven at this point. So I think Kenyon Sadiq can be that Tyler Warren type to get 100 potential targets this year, which you can't really say about any other tight end this year in college fantasy. Just because I think he is the lone option. And you listen to the quotes in the offseason, the Will Stein, the offensive coordinator, said in the spring game, I want to get Kenyon Sadiq 80 touches this season. Like, that's the goal. Doesn't happen, who knows? But that's kind of where I stand with Sadiq. He's in a bucket of his own. If I can't get Sadiq, there's about 6 to 7 other guys that I feel comfortable with in that, 8, 9, 10 round range. If I don't get them there, I'm falling back all the way till round 25, round 30, and just kind of knocking those guys off at the end in best ball or, in a redraft format as
Yeah, I
well.
think when you're playing best ball, there's a chance 3 tight ends probably go off the board. If you're in a redraft league, I don't think you see more than 2 go off per team in a 12-team format. You only got to worry about maybe the top 2 dozen, 30 tight ends, right? And so I'll give you a few minutes to kind of see where you want to go with the tight ends. I'll throw out a few thoughts, as you're looking tight ends, just as we talk about a few names. I like Matt Lauder at Boise State this year. Obviously, we know that Ashton Genty's gone. I do feel the passing game will be a little bit more of a factor this year. And he's a guy that had a solid year last year. I have him as my tight end 4. I think he's really solid value in a Boise State offense that's probably going to be as good as they were last year. I think he gets a few more looks this year. I'll highlight Jack Andrews. We know what, Texas did getting the ball to Gunnar Helm last year, particularly down the stretch. I know Texas played a lot of games, so that really inflated Gunnar Helm's stats last year. But in that offense where, we're looking at, they bring in Emmett Mosley, they have DeAndre Moore, um, who am I missing? My
Ryan
my
Wingo,
top. There you
DeAndre
go,
Moore.
Ryan
Yep.
Wingo. I don't know how I drew a blank on him. He's my wide receiver 1 there. They have some other options, but nobody that really blows the door off. I mean, when you look at proven receivers, Endries might be the best proven receiver coming over from Cal. So I like what he brings to that offense with Arch Manning, who you and I agree likely to spread the ball around this year. So he's a name I'd be looking at as well. And when it comes to just talent, I think the guys that for me, even though we talked about LSU and a lot of mouths to feed, Trey'Dez Green, physically gifted, has potential to really do some good things in that LSU offense. And then we talked about Miami and not necessarily having a ton. And then you've got one of those athletic guys as well, and Lofton. That's a guy who I think I'd be willing to take a stab on too, because if you're not looking to just get that average run of the mill tight end, I'm looking for the upside athletic tight ends, and those 2 names really pop off the charts to me. Where you got a few names at tight end on where you're looking at right now in that, as we get past the Sadiq and Stowers.
Yeah, it's a consistency with my rankings. Just I'll speak on this quick. The with the top 7 to 8 is that there is a high chance that they could lead their team in receiving and or like a very unproven wide receiver room, right? Stowers and Sadiq, like unproven wide receiver rooms. Justin Jolie, there's nobody at receiver for NC State, right? You feel good about Matt Lauder, who you spoke on at Boise State. Who's wide receiver one? Who's wide receiver 2 and 3 there? We have no idea, right? Wyoming, same thing, right? With John Michael Gillenborg. Joe Royer, who's wide receiver one there at Cincinnati? Probably Jeff Caldwell, but there's a chance that these tight ends that I just rattled off all could lead their teams in targets and receptions. So that's why we have them ranked so highly there. Trades Green and Elijah Lofton are definitely the wild cards of the group and the toughest to project, right? How many carries does Elijah Lofton get over the course of the year? And, Trades Green, we spoke about the LSU and a lot of mouths to feed there, but I would say there's a non-zero chance that he could lead the team in touchdown receptions this year. Like that's not out of the question for Trades Green. So I think those two are definitely the wild cards of the group in this year in college fantasy.
Well, then look, you just throw out a few other names. You got Traydon Seydou Traore at Mississippi State. We talked about Kevin Coleman moving on. I mean, he had a lot of receptions. I think he caught 30 something passes, maybe their second leading receiver last year from a reception standpoint. So he comes back, right? You got traditional tight end schools like Michigan and Penn State, to your point. We've got they're kind of hitting the reset button at tight end, right? So, will Luke Reynolds, will Hogan Hansen, if they were more proven names, would they be up higher on our list? Probably so, but we're not 100% sure yet, right? So those are a couple of places where you used to see in the tight ends ranked a little bit higher. And then you got RJ Maryland, who was very good until he got hurt last year, didn't even participate in spring. And then it's like, if he comes back fully healthy, he probably gives you value at that tight end spot. Again, it's a risk reward thing. Is he going to be fully healthy and ready to play come game one? Apparently, all signs lead to yes. If so, to your point, is RJ, Maryland the best wide receiver, considering we have Jordan Hudson at wide receiver one and SMU likes to spray the ball all over the field, right? So again, when it comes to philosophy with draft and tight ends, to your point, Mike, take a look at the guys that have potential to possibly lead their teams in receiving. That'll be the decision that you make on, should I draft this guy at this particular position or should I wait? Maybe that's the coin flip for you right there on deciding, maybe is this the round?
Yeah, that's definitely how I've been drafting. If I can't get that top 12 in our consensus rankings, then I'm kind of punting till the very end of drafts because I think that middle tier of guys that are getting drafted, there's just not a ton of upside with those selections. Like a Terrence Carter, a lot of question marks at Texas State because the offensive coordinator doesn't use the tight end position that much. Arliss Boardingham at Bowling Green, like we loved him before the coaching change.
Correct.
Now not so much. Who else? Dorian Fleming is a transfer from, Georgia Southern to Maryland. You always question the leap from G5
Yep.
to P4. So those guys in the middle rounds have a lot of question marks. So if I can't get that elite tier, the top 10 to 12, I'm probably punting and just kind of taking shots at like back end of the draft guys that I think could pop eventually.
And look, I brought up Michigan and Penn State, another school we were used to having some quality tight ends. We talk about Utah. We don't even have a Utah receiver in our top 20. We were talking, was it Hunter Andrews we were listening to, where they may use as like a Swiss Army knife, and then all of a sudden we see where Otto Tia, the receiver they brought in from Utah State, seems to be a better fit at receiver than he does seem to be at receiver right now. So there are just too many unknowns right now where if you're investing in best ball, might be best to just kind of stay away from right now. And that might be more of a redraft target if you're looking at schools like that right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Good stuff, man. Well, look, am I missing anything for receivers, tight ends? You want to put a bow on it, or should we wrap this thing up? I mean, it's midweek, but nothing says we can't close this thing down for a drink, man.
Yeah. Hey, I'm always down for one of those. No, just we'll just cap it off with this, and I'll go first. If you're going to punt till the very last round, right? Regardless of the format, who's a sleeper that you're kind of on, one or two? I'll just start
Okay.
Ethan Connor with Troy. You can get him in round 30 of your best balls. He was heavily targeted in the first month of the season before he suffered a season-ending injury. I like him. There's a lot of it speaks exactly to what we were just talking about with some of our elite tier guys. Who's the wide receiver one for Troy? We don't know. I like Jake Sewell at Akron. He's one of 7 tight ends that I have with 60 plus targets in my personal projections. That might be outlandish, but again, guy that you can get very late, and there's a lot of question marks with that wide receiver room. And then just real quick, the UTSA tight ends. I love Houston Thomas, and then Patrick Overmeyer is talented as well. I think they both land at P4 destinations a year from now. There's potential that they could eat into each other's target share, but they're very talented players, and we think UTSA is going to score a lot of points. So just a couple of guys that I think you can, if you decide to punt, you can get at the very back end of your drafts.
Yeah, and I don't know how far you go back. It might depend on on full FBS or P4, Mike. But I do think maybe a guy that's kind of intrigues me a little bit is Nick Harbor. I just think maybe we were 1 year too soon on him. But if Lenora Sellers improves anything, there's going to be defenses that are going to be keeping a close eye on him, maybe opening up some things in the passing game. I think keep an eye on Mike Matthews at Tennessee. I mean, I think that Tennessee passing game, I'm hoping it should be improved. They're going to need a wide receiver one to emerge, and I think now's the time for him there. If I'm looking at maybe another sleeper, somebody like Noah Rogers at NC State, we talked about maybe who do they have after the tight end Justin Jolie. I think CJ Bailey could be a sleeper quarterback for me, and I think that brings Noah Rogers into the equation. And then I think in full FBS, right now we're on TJ Pride at New Mexico State as wide receiver one, but knowing the offensive, who's the offensive coordinator that's there now? Why am I drawing a
Yost,
blank?
Yost.
Yost usually does do well with a wide receiver one. Right now, we're on TJ Pride, but it could be any one of those receivers they have on their roster right now. Keep an eye on New Mexico State's depth chart because their wide receiver one could be a good sleeper option in full FBS drafts.
Yeah.
There you go.
Now it's really time for a drink if we're talking about New Mexico
Ah,
State.
yeah, that's exactly right, man. Hey, look, let's wrap it up. This is the third show of the preseason preview series. We're going to probably hammer out some more throughout the summer, but again, all of the content that you see up is live on the site, the preseason draft guide, the projections, all of that content will get updated throughout the summer, will be updated throughout the preseason. And look, I'll even put the address up on the site. We've got to get this shelf behind me filled up. Who's going to send in Mike's Michigan helmet? Look, I'll give you shouts out. Let's start filling this thing up. But that's going to do it for this show. Receivers, tight ends, preseason preview series. For my partner Mike Bainbridge, my name's Joe DeSalvo. Let's call it a series, Mike. See you soon.